Sometimes the smallest choices change everything we thought we knew about our lives. Sometimes running away from one terrible moment leads us straight into our destiny. Evelyne was just a servant girl trying to escape her cruel overseer for one night. She saw the golden light from the castle ballroom and thought she'd found a safe place to hide. It looked like a beautiful celebration with music and dancing. She didn't know she was watching a vampire wedding ceremony. When she reached out to steady herself, she accidentally touched the sacred altar. That single touch bound her soul to Kael, the most powerful vampire lord in the kingdom. One mistake, one touch, 2 lives changed forever. A mortal servant girl and an immortal alpha, now tied together by ancient magic neither of them wanted. But when fate forces 2 lonely hearts together, who really controls the outcome? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Castle Ravencrest like the breath of ghosts, and in many ways, that's exactly what it was. For 3 centuries, this fortress had housed the most powerful vampire court in the known world, its towers reaching toward a sky that its inhabitants rarely saw in daylight. Deep within these walls, in the servants' quarters that smelled perpetually of lye soap and human exhaustion, Evelyne Whitmore pressed her face against the cold stone of her tiny window and watched the world wake up without her. Her small silver locket, the only thing she owned that wasn't provided by the castle, caught the pale light filtering through the narrow opening. Inside, the tarnished pendant lay a pressed forget-me-not, dry and fragile as her memories of the mother who had given it to her. Evelyne touched the locket gently, a ritual she performed every morning before the bell summoned her to another day of endless labor. "Girl, move yourself." The sharp voice of Matron Grimsby cut through the pre-dawn quiet like a blade. "Lord Aldrich wants his chambers scrubbed before the noon bell, and if you're late again, it's the stocks for you." Evelyne quickly tucked the locket beneath her rough linen dress and hurried from her cramped sleeping alcove. Around her, other servants were already stirring hollow-eyed women and bent-backed men who had learned long ago that survival in Castle Ravencrest meant never drawing attention to yourself. The vampire lords who ruled here were not cruel by nature, but they were predators, and even their kindness carried the weight of absolute power over mortal lives. She had been brought to the castle at age 10, sold by distant relatives who couldn't afford another mouth to feed. 13 years had passed since then, 13 years of washing floors, tending fires, and learning to make herself invisible when the immortal nobles swept through the corridors in their rich velvets and ancient jewels. Most servants didn't last half that long. Some fled in the night, others simply disappeared, and a few lucky ones earned enough coin to buy their freedom. Evelyne had never saved enough for freedom, but she had learned something more valuable: how to read the moods and movements of vampires well enough to avoid their displeasure. Lord Aldrich was particularly dangerous in the mornings. His chambers occupied the south tower, and despite the heavy curtains that blocked the sunlight, he never slept well during daylight hours. Evelyne had perfected the art of cleaning around his massive 4-poster bed without making a sound, even when he muttered and tossed in his supernatural slumber. This morning, however, she found his chambers empty. The bed was neatly made, unused, and through the window she could see carriages arriving in the courtyard below. Strange vampires rarely travelled during the day, and certainly not in such numbers. "You there, servant girl." The voice belonged to Master Henrik, the head of household staff. His pale skin and sharp features marked him as one of the turned servants, humans, who had served the court faithfully enough to be granted immortality, though not the status of true nobility. "Lord Kael has returned from the northern territories. All servants are to attend the evening celebration in the Great Hall." Evelyne's stomach tightened. She had seen Lord Kael only from a distance, but his reputation preceded him like a shadow. He was the alpha of the Ravencrest line, the most powerful vampire lord in 3 kingdoms, and it was said that his presence alone could make mortals faint with terror. More concerning still was his age. Nearly 600 years of existence had made him cold, calculating, and utterly without patience for human weakness. "What manner of celebration, Master Henrik?" she asked carefully. "The Lord's binding ceremony," Henrik replied, and something in his tone made her skin prickle. "He has chosen a mate at last. Lady Seraphina of the Blood Moon Court will arrive tonight, and their union will be sealed before the full moon rises." The implications settled over Evelyne like a heavy blanket. Vampire binding ceremonies were ancient, sacred rituals that tied immortal souls together for eternity. They were also incredibly rare. Most vampires lived centuries without finding a mate worthy of such a commitment. For Lord Kael to finally choose a partner meant that the political landscape of the vampire world was about to shift dramatically. As she continued her work throughout the day, Evelyne couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening. The castle buzzed with activity unlike anything she had witnessed in her 13 years of service. Vampire nobles arrived in carriages drawn by ghostly pale horses, their retinues filling the guest chambers to capacity. The kitchen staff worked frantically to prepare the blood wines and rare delicacies that immortal palates required, while human servants scurried through the corridors, hanging silk banners and polishing every surface until it gleamed. Meanwhile, several floors above in the Lord's private study, Kael Ravencrest stood before a window that offered no view of the sun, contemplating a decision that had taken him decades to make. At nearly 6 centuries old, he had outlived empires, watched kingdoms rise and fall, and seen enough of mortal ambition to grow weary of it all. The choice to bind himself to Lady Seraphina had been strategic rather than romantic. Their union would unite two of the most powerful vampire houses and strengthen his position against the growing threats from the Eastern territories. Yet, as he prepared for the ceremony that would seal his fate for eternity, Kael found himself thinking of the centuries stretching ahead with something approaching dread. Lady Seraphina was beautiful, intelligent, and utterly ruthless, qualities he had once admired in potential allies. As a mate, however, he wondered if she would understand the strange melancholy that had been growing in him over the past decades, the sense that all his power and immortality felt increasingly hollow. He dismissed the thought as weakness. Vampires of his age and status did not indulge in romantic notions. The binding ceremony was a political necessity, nothing more. Still, when his reflection caught his eye in the dark glass of the window, he was surprised by how tired he looked. His dark hair showed no signs of age, his pale skin remained unmarked by time, but his eyes held the weight of too many years and too many compromises. "My lord." His personal attendant, Marcus, appeared in the doorway with the respectful bow required of all who served him. "The preparations are complete. Lady Seraphina's carriage has been sighted on the mountain road. She will arrive within the hour." "Very well." Kyle turned from the window, his moment of introspection over. "Have the ceremonial robes prepared, and Marcus ensure that the great hall is cleared of all unnecessary personnel. Only the noble houses and essential staff are to witness the binding." "Of course, my lord. However, there is one matter: the household servants have been promised attendance at the celebration afterward. It is traditional to allow them to witness the joy of their lord's union." Kael considered this. In truth, he cared little whether the servants attended or not, but traditions in vampire society were not to be taken lightly. "Very well. They may observe from the gallery during the celebration, but the ceremony itself remains restricted." As evening approached, and the castle filled with the soft glow of hundreds of candles, Evelyne found herself swept along with the other servants toward the great hall. She had managed to avoid most celebration duties by keeping her head down, but Matron Grimsby had specifically assigned her to tend the flower arrangements during the evening's festivities. The great hall was a marvel of Gothic architecture. Its vaulted ceilings, supported by massive stone columns, carved with intricate designs that seemed to shift and move in the flickering candlelight. Tonight, it had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with silk banners in deep crimson and gold hanging from the walls, and thousands of candles casting everything in a warm, honeyed glow. Evelyne had never seen anything so beautiful. As she arranged white roses and dark ivy around the base of the great columns, she found herself stealing glances at the vampire nobles who had begun to gather for the celebration. They moved with an otherworldly grace, their conversation a low murmur that somehow filled the vast space without echoing. The women wore gowns that seemed to be cut from moonlight and shadow, while the men were dressed in rich velvets and silks that spoke of wealth beyond mortal comprehension. At the far end of the hall stood the ceremonial altar, an ancient stone structure carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The sacred binding altar, she had heard it called, though she had never seen it used before tonight. According to whispered stories among the servants, it was older than the castle itself, brought here by the first vampire lords who had claimed these mountains as their domain. As the evening progressed, Evelyne lost herself in the beauty and strangeness of it all. From her position near the servants' gallery, she could see everything without being noticed: the arrival of Lady Seraphina in a gown that seemed to be woven from starlight, the formal presentations between the noble houses, and finally, the entrance of Lord Carl himself. She had never seen him so clearly before, and the sight took her breath away. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of great weariness. His dark hair was pulled back to reveal a face that was both beautiful and terrible in its perfection, and when his gaze swept the assembled crowd, Evelyne felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cold stone walls. The ceremony began with ancient words spoken in a language that predated any mortal tongue, and as it progressed, Evelyne found herself mesmerized by the ritual's stark beauty. This was history unfolding before her eyes, the kind of moment that would be whispered about in the servants' quarters for generations to come. She never intended to leave her assigned post. She never meant to draw closer to the altar where Lord Kyle and Lady Seraphina stood, surrounded by the soft glow of ceremonial candles. But something about the scene called to her, perhaps the beauty of it, perhaps some deeper instinct she couldn't name. Step by careful step, she moved closer to the central ceremony, drawn by forces she didn't understand. The sacred binding altar seemed to pulse with a life of its own as the ceremony reached its climax. The ancient stones were covered in carvings that seemed to shift and dance in the candlelight, and Evelyne found herself close enough to see the intricate details of the vampire runes that spiraled across its surface. It was then that Lord Aldrich, wine-drunk and careless, stumbled backward from his position near the altar. His elbow caught Evelyne squarely in the ribs, and the force of the blow sent her staggering forward. She reached out instinctively to catch herself, her palm landing flat against the carved surface of the sacred binding altar. The world exploded into light and sensation. Power surged through her like lightning, ancient magic recognizing the touch of mortal flesh and responding with devastating precision. The altar blazed with supernatural fire, and every vampire in the great hall turned to stare as the impossible happened. The binding ceremony meant for Lord Kyle and Lady Seraphina shattered like glass, its power redirecting itself toward the terrified servant girl who had unknowingly claimed a place in vampire destiny. Evelyne felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, as if invisible chains had wrapped themselves around her heart and soul. Across the altar, Lord Kyle's eyes went wide with shock and something that might have been recognition. The sacred binding altar completed its ancient purpose, sealing a connection that would last for eternity. But instead of binding together two vampire nobles in a political alliance, it had tied the soul of the most powerful immortal lord in the kingdom to a mortal servant girl who had never even spoken his name. In the stunned silence that followed, as hundreds of vampire eyes stared at her with mixtures of outrage and disbelief, Evelyne realized that her life, as she had known it, was over. Whatever came next would be shaped by forces far beyond her understanding, and all because she had reached out to steady herself against an altar she had no business touching. The locket at her throat seemed to burn against her skin, and for a moment she thought she could smell forget-me-nots blooming in an impossible garden that existed only in her fading memories of childhood. Then Lord Kael's voice cut through the silence like a blade, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. "What have you done?" Lord Kael's voice carried across the great hall like winter wind, cold enough to freeze blood in mortal veins. Every conversation stopped, every breath held. Even the candle flames seemed to still in the sudden, terrible quiet. Evelyne couldn't move. The power that had surged through her when she touched the altar still echoed in her bones, and something fundamental had changed inside her chest. She could feel Lord Kael's presence as if he were standing directly beside her, though he remained across the ceremonial space. Worse still, she could sense his emotions, shock, fury, and beneath it all, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of centuries lived without joy. I didn't mean to," she began, but her words died as Lady Seraphina stepped forward, her beautiful face twisted with rage. "This mortal creature has destroyed our sacred ceremony." Lady Seraphina's voice rang through the hall like breaking glass. "She has violated the most ancient of our laws. The penalty for such blasphemy is death." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled vampire nobles. Evelyne saw hands move to ornate sword hilts, saw eyes that glowed with hunger for her blood. She had stumbled into something far beyond her understanding, and the price would clearly be her life. But Lord Kael raised one pale hand, and silence fell again like a curtain. "The binding is complete." His words carried the weight of absolute authority. "The sacred binding altar has chosen, as it has for 1,000 years. The magic cannot be undone." "Surely you cannot mean to honor this accident," Lord Aldrich sputtered, his wine-flushed face pale with shock. "She is nothing but a servant, a mortal. To bind yourself to such a creature—" "Mind your tongue, Aldrich." Kael's eyes flashed with danger. "You would do well to remember that your clumsiness caused this situation. Had you not stumbled into the girl? The girl should not have been near the altar at all." Lady Seraphina interrupted, her voice sharp with betrayal and fury. "This is madness, Kael. Surely the binding can be broken. There must be some way." "There is no way." The new voice belonged to Elder Matthias, the oldest vampire in the court and keeper of their ancient laws. He stepped forward from the crowd of nobles, his silver hair gleaming in the candlelight. "The sacred binding altar recognizes no hierarchy, no status, no intention. It responds only to the touch of souls meant to be joined. If the magic has accepted this mortal, then she is bound to Lord Kael for eternity." "Eternity?" Evelyne's voice came out as barely a whisper. The word felt too large, too impossible. She was 23 years old, with perhaps 50 more years of life if she was fortunate. How could she be bound for eternity to a creature who had already lived 20 times her entire lifespan? "The binding grants certain protections to mortal partners." Elder Matthias continued, his ancient eyes studying her with interest. "Extended life, immunity to vampire influence, and the full protection of the bound Lord's house. You will not age as mortals do, child. The magic will sustain you for as long as the bond endures." The implications crashed over her like a tide. Not only was she bound to Lord Kael, but she was no longer entirely human. The life she had known, the simple future she had sometimes dared to imagine, all of it was gone, replaced by something she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "This is impossible," Lady Seraphina said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier fury. "Kael, we had an agreement. Our houses were to be united. The political implications will have to be managed," Kael replied, though Evelyne could sense through their new connection that he was struggling to contain his own shock and anger. "What is done cannot be undone, Seraphina. You know the laws as well as I do." Around the great hall, vampire nobles whispered among themselves in languages older than human memory. Evelyne caught fragments of their conversations, talk of precedent, of political ramifications, of the disruption to carefully laid plans. She was the center of a crisis that would ripple through vampire society for years to come. "The blood crown of binding," Elder Matthias said suddenly, his voice cutting through the murmured discussions. "It must be retrieved from the ceremonial chamber. If the binding is truly complete, the crown will recognize the new union." Two vampire attendants hurried away at his gesture, and within moments they returned, carrying an ornate crown that seemed to be carved from a single piece of dark crystal. The blood crown of binding was said to be older than recorded history, a relic of the first vampire lords who had established the sacred ceremonies. Elder Matthias took the crown and approached Evelyne slowly, as if she were a wild creature who might bolt at any moment. "Child, if the binding is true, this crown will glow with inner fire when placed upon your brow. If it is false, if somehow the magic was corrupted or incomplete, the crown will remain dark, and Lord Kyle will be free of this accidental union." Evelyne looked across the altar at Lord Kyle. His face revealed nothing, but through their strange new connection, she could feel his tension. Part of him hoped the crown would remain dark, she realized. Part of him wanted to be free of this complication she had brought into his ordered existence. The thought stung more than it should have. Elder Matthias placed the blood crown of binding on her head, and immediately the crystal blazed with crimson light. The glow was visible even in the candlelit hall, casting red shadows on the stone walls and illuminating every face turned toward her. There could be no doubt now the binding was real, complete, and unbreakable. "By the ancient laws," Elder Matthias announced, "I declare Evelyne Whitmore to be the bound mate of Lord Kyle Ravencrest, with all the rights and protections thereof." The formal declaration sent another wave of whispers through the crowd, but these were different, more calculating, more resigned. The vampire nobles were already beginning to adapt to this new reality, to consider how it might affect their own positions and alliances. Lady Seraphina stepped forward once more, and for a moment Evelyne thought she might strike her. Instead, the vampire lady studied her with cold, measuring eyes. "You have cost me a great deal this night, mortal," she said quietly. "I suggest you learn quickly how to survive in a world that was not made for your kind." With that, Lady Seraphina turned and swept from the great hall, her retinue following in a rustling of silk and barely contained anger. Several other noble houses departed as well, clearly displeased with this unexpected turn of events. Lord Kyle watched them go with an expression of grim acceptance. When the last of the departing nobles had left, he finally approached Evelyne. Up close, she could see that his perfect features were marked by exhaustion and something that might have been regret. "We need to speak," he said simply, "but not here, not with half the court watching our every word." He gestured toward a side door that led to the private corridors of the castle. Evelyne followed, acutely aware of the stares that followed their departure. She could feel the weight of the blood crown on her head, its crystal surface still glowing faintly with the power of their binding. As they walked through corridors she had only glimpsed from a distance, Evelyne tried to process everything that had happened. An hour ago she had been a servant whose greatest concern was avoiding Lord Aldrich's displeasure. Now she was bound for eternity to the most powerful vampire in the kingdom, wearing a crown that marked her as his equal in the eyes of ancient law. "I know you did not intend for this to happen," Lord Kyle said as they reached his private study. "But intention matters little now. We are bound by magic older than human civilization, and there is no power in this world or any other that can break what has been forged." Evelyne touched the locket at her throat, seeking comfort in its familiar weight. "What happens now? Now we learn to live with the consequences of fate's sense of humor," Kael replied, and for the first time since she had known of his existence, she heard something almost human in his voice. You cannot return to the servants' quarters. The binding has changed you, changed us both. You will need new chambers, new clothing, education in our ways. And you? She asked, surprising herself with her boldness. What do you need? He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and through their connection, she felt something shift, a crack in the wall he had built around his emotions. Time, he said simply. Time to understand what the binding has cost us both, and what it might yet grant us in return. The blood crown pulsed once more with inner light, as if responding to the tentative hope in his words. Outside the study windows, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. For the first time in her life, Evelyne watched the sunrise from a place of power instead of servitude. She was no longer Evelyne the servant. She was bound to destiny now, for better or worse, and there was no turning back. The chambers of the bound occupied an entire wing of Castle Ravencrest that Evelyne had never seen before. Ancient tapestries depicting vampire history covered the stone walls, their rich colors unfaded by time thanks to the careful preservation magic that permeated every thread. Windows tall enough for giants looked out over the mountain valleys, framed by curtains of midnight blue silk that could block out the harshest sunlight or allow the gentlest moonbeams to filter through. Evelyne stood in the center of the main chamber, overwhelmed by the sheer size of everything around her. The bed alone was larger than the room she had shared with 3 other servant girls. 4 carved posts supported a canopy of deep burgundy velvet, and the mattress was thick enough to sink into like a cloud. She had never slept on anything softer than straw-stuffed canvas. These chambers have housed bound pairs for over 4 centuries, Master Henrik explained as he directed a procession of servants carrying Evelyne's meager belongings. The magic woven into the walls provides protection and privacy that extends beyond the physical realm. Evelyne touched the silver locket at her throat, still hardly believing that she belonged in such a place. 3 hours ago, Jones, she had owned nothing but a rough linen dress and her mother's forgotten flower. Now servants were arranging silk gowns in wardrobes larger than some houses, and a personal lady's maid was being assigned to attend her every need. I don't understand how any of this works, she admitted to Henrik. Yesterday I was cleaning Lord Aldrich's chambers. Today I'm... What am I, exactly? You are Lord Kael's bound mate, Henrik replied with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the weather. In the eyes of vampire law, you now hold the second highest position in this entire kingdom. Every vampire noble, every turned servant, even the ancient elders, owe you respect and protection. The concept felt impossible. Evelyne had spent 13 years learning to make herself invisible, to move through the castle without drawing attention or displeasure. The idea that she now commanded the respect of creatures who could kill her with a thought seemed like the worst sort of dream. What does Lord Kael expect from me? She asked quietly. Henrik paused in his supervision of the servant arrangements. That, my lady, is a question only he can answer. The binding is different for every pair. Some find companionship, others merely tolerance. A few discover something approaching love, though such cases are rare. Love. The words seemed to hang in the air between them like incense smoke. Evelyne had never considered love as something that might happen to someone like her. Servant girls married other servants if they were fortunate, or lived alone if they were not. Love was a luxury for people who had choices about their futures. A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," Henrik called, and to Evelyne's surprise, Lord Kael himself stepped into the room. The servants immediately dropped into deep bows, and Henrik stepped forward with practiced deference. "My lord, the chambers are being prepared according to your instructions." "Leave us," Kael said simply. "All of you." The room emptied in moments, leaving Evelyne alone with the vampire lord she was now bound to for eternity. In the privacy of the chambers, without the watching eyes of the court, he seemed somehow different, less imposing, though no less dangerous. "You look overwhelmed," he observed, moving to stand near one of the tall windows. "I feel overwhelmed," Evelyne replied honestly. "This morning I knew exactly who I was and what my life would be. Now I don't know anything." Kael nodded slowly, as if he understood the feeling better than she might expect. "Tell me about yourself, Evelyne. Before tonight, I knew nothing of you beyond your name and position." The request surprised her. "There isn't much to tell, my lord. I've been a servant here for 13 years. I clean chambers, tend fires, arrange flowers when needed. I can read and write well enough, thanks to a tutor who took pity on me when I was young." "You said 13 years. How old were you when you came here?" 10. "My parents died of fever, and my uncle sold me to the castle rather than feed another mouth." The words came out matter-of-factly. It was ancient history now, and she had learned long ago that dwelling on past sorrows served no purpose. Something flickered across Kael's features, anger, perhaps, or sympathy. Through their strange new connection, she could sense his emotions like distant music, too faint to identify clearly but unmistakably present. "And in all those years, did you never dream of leaving, of finding some different life?" Evelyne considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, but dreams and reality are different things. Servants don't get to choose their destinies, my lord. We simply endure them." "Kael," he said unexpectedly. "My lord, my name is Kael. We are bound now. You need not use titles when we are alone." The informality felt strange on her tongue when she tried it. "Kael." She paused, gathering courage for the question that had been burning in her mind. "What do you dream of?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I used to dream of conquest, of expanding my territory, of gaining power over rival houses. Later, I dreamed of peace, of an end to the constant political maneuvering and bloodshed. And now? Now I find myself bound to a mortal woman I know nothing about, and I'm not certain what to dream of anymore." The honesty in his words surprised her. She had expected anger, or resignation, or cold calculation. She hadn't expected this glimpse of uncertainty from a creature who commanded absolute power. "The binding, what does it mean for you?" she asked. "I know what Henrik told me about my new position, but what changes for someone who has lived for centuries?" Kael turned from the window to look at her directly. "Everything," he said simply. "The magic ties our life forces together. Your emotions affect mine, and mine yours. Your pain becomes my pain, your joy my joy. In time, we will be able to share thoughts, memories, even dreams." The implications made her stomach flutter with something between excitement and terror. "That sounds intimate. More intimate than marriage. More permanent than death," Kael agreed. "It's why vampire bindings are rare and treated with such gravity. To bind with someone is to surrender the solitude that has defined immortal existence." "Do you regret it?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Kael was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully measured. "Ask me again in a century, and perhaps I will know." The answer wasn't rejection, but it wasn't acceptance either. Evelyne found herself studying his face, trying to read the emotions that flickered across his perfect features. Through their connection, she could sense layers of feeling: curiosity, wariness, something that might have been loneliness, and beneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of too many years carrying too much responsibility. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow we begin learning to live with each other," Kael replied. "You will need education in vampire customs, politics, history. You will need to understand your new role and the expectations that come with it. And you? I will need to learn how to share a life that has been solitary for 6 centuries. He moved toward the chamber door, then paused. The connection between us will grow stronger with time. Tonight, you may feel echoes of my emotions. By tomorrow, the bond will have deepened. After he left, Evelyne found herself alone in chambers that seemed designed for someone far grander than a former servant girl. She touched her mother's locket one more time, then carefully removed the blood crown from her head. It had stopped glowing, but she could still feel the power that hummed within the dark crystal. Outside her windows, the castle settled into its nighttime rhythm. Somewhere in these same corridors, Ka-El was adjusting to the reality of their binding just as she was. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead, she found it oddly comforting. For the first time in 13 years, she was not alone. The mirror of true sight had been hidden in the deepest vault of the chambers of the bound for over 2 centuries, and Ka-El had forgotten it existed until Evelyne stumbled upon it 3 days after their binding. She had been exploring the warren of rooms that made up their shared living space, something he had encouraged, though he wasn't entirely certain why, when she discovered the small chamber behind what appeared to be a solid stone wall. Ka-El? Her voice carried through their connection even before she called his name aloud. The bond had indeed grown stronger, just as he had predicted. Where once he had sensed only the faintest echo of her emotions, now he could feel her curiosity and wonder as clearly as his own thoughts. He found her standing before an ornate mirror framed in silver that seemed to writhe and shift in the candlelight. The glass itself looked ordinary enough, but Ka-El recognized it immediately. The mirror of true sight was one of the most dangerous artifacts in the castle, capable of showing viewers their deepest desires and most hidden fears. "Don't look into it directly," he warned, moving to stand beside her. "That mirror has driven lesser minds to madness." "What does it do?" Evelyne asked, though she obediently kept her gaze fixed on the frame rather than the glass. "It shows truth, not the truth we tell ourselves or the truth we wish to see, but the truth that lives in the deepest parts of our souls." Ka-El studied the mirror with the caution of someone who had learned not to underestimate ancient magic. The last vampire lord who looked into it spent 3 days screaming. "And yet you keep it here, in our chambers." The question made him pause. "I had forgotten it was here. These rooms have been sealed for decades. You are the first person besides myself to enter them in my lifetime." Evelyne turned to look at him then, her brown eyes wide with surprise. "You've lived alone here for decades?" "Centuries," Ka-El corrected. "I have had companions, of course, political alliances, brief affairs, arrangements of convenience. But I have never shared these particular chambers with another soul." Through their bond, he felt her emotional response to this revelation, not pity, which would have angered him, but something softer, understanding perhaps, or recognition. It occurred to him that she too knew what it meant to be alone, even surrounded by others. "The binding ceremony was meant to take place in the Great Hall," he continued, not entirely certain why he was sharing these details. "Lady Seraphina would have maintained her own chambers in the East Wing. Our union would have been political, formal, separate. But now," Evelyne asked quietly, "now we are tied together in ways I never intended or imagined." The words carried more weight than he had meant them to. "The magic has made us connected in ways that go far beyond political alliance." As if summoned by their conversation, the mirror of true sight began to glow with a soft, pearl-like light. Ka-El immediately stepped back, pulling Evelyne with him, but she resisted. "What if we look together?" she asked suddenly. "You said it shows truth. Maybe we need to see what truth it would show us." "Absolutely not." Ka-El's voice carried the authority of 6 centuries. "Evelyne, you don't understand what you're suggesting. The mirror doesn't simply show pleasant truths. It reveals the things we most fear to acknowledge about ourselves." "I'm not afraid," she said, though her heartbeat quickened in a way that suggested otherwise. "I am," Kyle admitted, and the honesty surprised them both. Through their connection, he felt her shock at his confession, followed by something that felt remarkably like affection. "You're afraid of what the mirror might show you about our binding," she said, and it wasn't a question. He wanted to deny it. But the bond between them made deception impossible. She could feel the truth of her words resonating through his carefully constructed emotional walls. "I have spent 6 centuries building my life around control, predictability, power," he said finally. "The binding threatens all of that. Yes, I am afraid of what the mirror might reveal about how completely it has changed me." Evelyne studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. For someone who had spent most of her life as a servant, learning to read the moods of her betters for survival, she was remarkably perceptive. "What if it showed something good?" she asked. "What if the truth isn't as terrible as you fear?" "And what if it is?" Kyle countered. "What if the mirror reveals that our binding is nothing but an accident of fate with no deeper meaning? What if it shows that you are destined to grow, to hate the creature you've been tied to for eternity?" The words hung between them like a blade. Through their connection, Evelyne felt the depth of his fear, not just of the mirror, but of her eventual rejection. It was a vulnerability he had never meant to reveal, and the exposure of it made him want to retreat to the safety of his study. Instead, Evelyne reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm against his perpetually cool skin, and the simple contact sent a shock of sensation through the bond between them. "I don't know what the mirror would show," she said quietly, "but I know that 3 days ago I thought my life was over when the binding happened. These past days talking with you, learning about your world, feeling less alone than I have in years, maybe that's worth facing whatever truth the mirror holds." Kyle looked down at their joined hands. When was the last time someone had touched him without calculation, without seeking advantage or power? When had anyone last offered him comfort instead of asking for favors? "You have no idea what you're asking," he said, though his resistance was weakening. "Then explain it to me," Evelyne challenged. "Tell me what you're so afraid I'll see." The words came out before he could stop them. "That I am exactly what everyone believes me to be. A creature so removed from humanity that even an eternity bound to you cannot restore whatever capacity for love I may have once possessed." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful in its honesty. Through their bond, Evelyne felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the loneliness, the gradual erosion of warmth from his heart, the fear that power had cost him everything that made existence meaningful. "And what are you afraid the mirror will show about me?" she asked gently. Kyle met her eyes, and in them he saw a strength that surprised him. "That you deserve far better than fate has given you, that binding you to me was not destiny but cruelty." Evelyne was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and sure. "What if we made a pact? We look in the mirror together, and whatever we see, good or terrible, we face it honestly. No pretending, no hiding from the truth. And if the truth destroys what small understanding we've built between us, then at least we'll know where we stand," Evelyne replied. "I would rather live with honest knowledge than comfortable lies." Kyle studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or fear. Instead, he found determination that reminded him of warriors he had known across the centuries, people who faced impossible odds with clear eyes and steady hearts. Against his better judgment, against centuries of careful self-preservation, he found himself nodding. "Very well," he said, "but we do this together or not at all." Evelyne squeezed his hand once, then turned to face the mirror of true sight. "Together," she agreed. The Chronicle of Ancient Bindings lay open on the massive oak table in Kyle's private study, its pages yellowed with age and written in languages that predated most human civilizations. Elder Matthias had brought the forbidden tome at Kyle's request, though not without considerable reluctance and warnings about the dangerous knowledge it contained. "These records were sealed for good reason," the ancient vampire had said as he placed the heavy leather-bound volume on the table. The history of mortal vampire bindings is not a pleasant one. Now, 3 days after their encounter with the Mirror of True Sight, Kael and Evelyne sat together reading accounts that made them both question whether their bond was a gift or a curse. The mirror had shown them truths that neither had expected, not the rejection and incompatibility they had feared, but images of a future where their connection brought both great joy and terrible danger. "Listen to this," Evelyne said, her finger tracing lines of text written in an archaic form of their common tongue. "The binding of Lord Marcus Thorne to the mortal maiden Isabella Crane, Anno Domini 1347. Their love grew strong and true, but the court could not accept a mortal queen. On the 3rd anniversary of their binding, Lord Thorne's own council ordered her execution. He destroyed half his kingdom in rage before taking his own life to join her in death." Kael looked up from his own section of the Chronicle, where he had been reading an equally disturbing account. "They are all tragedies, Evelyne. Every single binding between vampire and mortal ended in death, madness, or exile." "Not all of them," she corrected, turning several pages. "Here Lord Victor Ravencrest and Lady Elena of Whitmore, 1523. They ruled together for 40 years before retiring to the northern mountains, where they lived in peace until her natural death." Ravencrest. Kael moved to read over her shoulder, his attention caught by the familiar name. "I had no idea there was a previous binding in my bloodline. Victor was your great-great-grandfather," Elder Matthias said from the doorway, where he had appeared with the silent grace that marked all ancient vampires. "His union with Lady Elena was the last successful mortal vampire binding in recorded history." Kael and Evelyne exchanged glances. Through their bond, he could feel her mixture of hope and apprehension at this revelation. Why was their binding successful when so many others failed? Kael asked. Elder Matthias entered the study and settled into one of the leather chairs with a sigh that spoke of centuries. Several factors. Victor was young by vampire standards, only 2 centuries old when he bound to Elena. He had not yet developed the emotional distance that comes with great age. More importantly, Elena was not merely mortal. "What do you mean?" Evelyne leaned forward, her interest sharpening. She was descended from an ancient bloodline, one that carried traces of supernatural heritage, not vampire, but something older, what the texts call blood of the awakened. It made her stronger, more resilient, better able to withstand the changes the binding would bring. Kael felt something cold settle in his chest. "Are you suggesting that Evelyne—" "I am suggesting nothing," Elder Matthias interrupted carefully. "I am merely providing historical context. However, there are certain indicators that might bear investigation." "What kind of indicators?" Evelyne asked, though Kael could sense through their bond that part of her already suspected what the elder might say. "The binding itself. For one, the sacred binding altar has never activated for a purely mortal touch. In 800 years of recorded ceremonies, it has only responded to those with supernatural heritage." Elder Matthias studied Evelyne with ancient, knowing eyes. "Then there is the matter of how quickly you adapted to the bond's effects. Most mortals require weeks to adjust to the psychic connection. You manifested the ability within hours." Kael's mind raced through the implications. If Evelyne has supernatural heritage, why was she living as a servant? Surely her family would have known. "Not necessarily," Elder Matthias replied. "Bloodlines can lie dormant for generations. A child might be born to parents who carry the gift but cannot access it themselves. Often, the awakening only comes through trauma, great emotion, or magical binding to a powerful vampire," Evelyne finished, her voice quiet with understanding. The 3 of them sat in silence for several moments, absorbing the weight of this possibility. Through their bond, Kael felt Evelyne's struggle to reconcile this new information with everything she had believed about herself and her origins. "There would be ways to confirm it," Elder Matthias said eventually. "Tests, rituals that could determine the nature and strength of any supernatural heritage. And if the tests prove that Evelyne does carry this bloodline, Kael asked, then your binding follows historical precedent, and there is hope for a successful union. Elder Matthias paused. However, it would also mean that certain political factions will view your mate as a threat rather than merely an inconvenience. What kind of threat? Evelyne asked, though Kael sensed she was beginning to understand the answer. A mortal servant accidentally bound to a vampire lord is a curiosity, an embarrassment at worst, Elder Matthias explained. But a woman of awakened bloodline, legitimately bound and protected by ancient law, with the potential to bear children who might inherit both vampire power and her unique heritage, that is a force that could reshape vampire society. The implications hit Kael like a physical blow. The other houses would never accept it. Some would embrace it, Elder Matthias corrected. Others would seek to eliminate the threat before it could manifest. The Blood Moon Court, in particular, would view Evelyne as an obstacle to their long-term plans for regional dominance. Lady Seraphina's family, Evelyne said, understanding immediately. They expected to gain influence through marriage to you. Now they face the possibility that my mate might possess power that could rival their own, Kael finished grimly. Elder Matthias rose from his chair, his ancient joints creaking slightly. I suggest you proceed carefully with any testing or investigation. Knowledge is power, but it can also be a weapon in the hands of enemies. After the elder left, Kael and Evelyne returned to the Chronicle of Ancient Bindings, but the words seemed to blur together as they both contemplated the possible ramifications of her heritage. Are you afraid? Kael asked finally. Terrified, Evelyne admitted. 3 weeks ago, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was being assigned to clean the torture chambers. Now I might be descended from supernatural royalty and married to a vampire lord with enemies who want me dead. Kael reached across the table and took her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. Whatever your heritage proves to be, you have my protection. The full strength of House Ravencrest stands behind you. And what if that's not enough? She asked quietly. Through their bond, Kael felt her fear not just for herself, but for him, for the position she might be putting him in by merely existing. The depth of her concern for his welfare touched something in his chest that he had thought long dead. Then we face whatever comes together, he said simply. As we have everything else since the binding. Evelyne squeezed his hand, and through their connection he felt her gratitude and growing affection. Whatever secrets her bloodline might hold, whatever enemies might emerge to challenge them, they would not face the future alone. The chronicle lay open between them, its pages full of warnings and tragedies, but also, if they looked carefully, hints of hope. The pendant of shared dreams had belonged to Kael's great-great-grandmother, Lady Elena of Whitmore, and it had been sealed away in the family vault since her death nearly 3 centuries ago. When Elder Matthias presented it to them as a means of strengthening their bond and possibly confirming Evelyne's heritage, neither Kael nor Evelyne had anticipated how profoundly it would change the nature of their relationship. The pendant itself was deceptively simple, a smooth oval of moonstone suspended on a silver chain, with no visible ornamentation or magical symbols. Yet when Evelyne wore it to sleep, and Kael maintained physical contact with her throughout the night, their dreams became shared experiences that revealed truths neither had been prepared to face. I saw your childhood, Evelyne said quietly, as dawn light filtered through the heavy curtains of their chambers. They lay in the massive bed that had once seemed impossibly large to her, now made intimate by necessity and growing comfort with each other's presence. You were so small, so afraid. Kael's hand tightened slightly where it rested against her shoulder, maintaining the contact necessary for the pendant's magic to work. In their shared dream, she had witnessed his early years as a vampire, the terror of his transformation, the decades of learning to control bloodlust, the gradual erosion of his human memories and emotions. "I had forgotten how frightened I was," he admitted. "After centuries, the memories blur together. I remember the facts of my transformation, but not the feelings." "You were alone," Evelyne continued, her voice soft with sympathy. "Your sire abandoned you after the turning. You had to learn everything by yourself, how to feed, how to control your strength, how to survive in vampire society." "It was a different time," Kael replied, though through their bond she could feel the old pain the memories had stirred up. Vampires believed that harsh conditions produce stronger offspring. Sink or swim, as mortals might say. Evelyne turned in his arms to face him, studying his perfect, ageless features in the dim light. "Is that why you find it difficult to trust, to let anyone close?" The question cut deeper than she had intended. Through the pendant's magic, Ka-El had seen her memories as well, childhood, with loving parents before their deaths, the uncle who sold her more from desperation than cruelty, the small kindnesses from fellow servants that had sustained her through years of hardship. Her capacity for trust and affection had been battered, but not broken. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "when you learn early that survival depends on self-reliance, it becomes difficult to believe that others might act without ulterior motives. Even now, with me." Kyle was quiet for a long moment, and through their connection, Evelyne could feel him wrestling with his answer. The pendant had made deception impossible between them. Their dreams revealed not just memories, but the emotions and motivations behind them. "I am trying to learn otherwise," he said finally. "The dreams we share, they show me how you think, how you feel. There is no calculation in your kindness, no hidden agenda in your concern for my welfare. It is unusual in my experience." Evelyne reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone. "What else did you see in my memories?" "Your mother's garden," Kael replied immediately. "The forget-me-nots she grew in the little plot behind your cottage. You were perhaps 6 years old, helping her tend them while she told you stories about their meaning." "True love and faithful remembrance," Evelyne said softly. She said forget-me-nots bloomed for those who kept love alive, even when everything else was lost. "And the locket, she gave you her own mother's flower pressed inside. A piece of love to carry always," she said. "Something that would remind me that I was worthy of being cherished, even when the world tried to tell me otherwise." Through their bond, Kael felt the depth of loss that memory still carried, but also the strength it had given her. Her mother's love had been brief but profound, creating a foundation of self-worth that 13 years of servitude had been unable to completely destroy. "There was something else in your memories," he said carefully. "Moments when you seemed to know things you shouldn't have known. When you could sense the moods of the vampire nobles before they spoke. When you instinctively avoided areas of the castle where danger waited." Evelyne nodded slowly. "I always thought it was just good survival instincts. Servants learn to read their betters carefully. But it was more than that. In the shared dreams, I could feel the supernatural awareness that guided you. You have been unconsciously accessing your heritage for years." The realization settled between them like a heavy blanket. If Evelyne truly did carry supernatural bloodline, if her abilities had been manifesting subtly throughout her life, then her binding to Kael had not been the accident they had believed, but something approaching destiny. "I'm frightened," she admitted. "Not of what I might be, but of what it might mean for us. Elder Matthias said the other houses would see me as a threat. What if they're right? What if loving me puts you in danger?" The words slipped out before she realized she had spoken it loving. In the intimacy of their shared dreams and whispered conversations, the emotion had grown so naturally that acknowledging it felt as inevitable as sunrise. Kael's response came through their bond. Before he spoke aloud, a surge of warmth and fierce protectiveness that took her breath away. "Let them see you as a threat," he said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. Let them understand that you are under my protection, and that any harm to you will be met with the full fury of House Ravencrest. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. Kyle pulled her closer, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his unnecessary heartbeat against her chest. You fear that your heritage will bring me political complications, that loving you will cost me power or position. Won't it? Probably, Kyle admitted with a hint of dark humor. But Evelyne, in 6 centuries of existence, I have gained and lost power, built and destroyed alliances, conquered territories, and seen them fall to ruin. All of it felt meaningless, empty, the actions of a creature going through motions without purpose. He paused, his hand finding the pendant at her throat where it rested against her skin. These past weeks with you, learning to share thoughts and dreams and quiet moments, this is the first time in centuries that I have felt truly alive. If that costs me every political alliance I have built, so be it. Through the pendant's magic, Evelyne felt the absolute truth of his words, the depth of emotion he was offering her. The vampire lord who had ruled through cold calculation and careful distance was choosing love over power, connection over safety. The Vampire Council has requested a formal audience, Kyle continued. They want to question you about the binding, assess your status and potential threat to established order. When? Tomorrow night. Elder Matthias will stand as your advocate, and I will be present to ensure your protection. Evelyne nodded, though anxiety fluttered in her chest. Will they try to break the binding? They cannot, Kyle said firmly. But they may try to limit your influence or demand guarantees about your future behavior. And if I refuse to cooperate? Kyle's smile was sharp as a blade, carrying the promise of violence. Then they will learn exactly how dangerous it is to threaten what belongs to me. The possessiveness in his words should have alarmed her, but instead it sent warmth spreading through her chest. After years of belonging to no one, of being nothing more than a useful tool, being claimed by someone who would fight for her felt like the greatest gift imaginable. Whatever they decide, she said, settling more comfortably against his chest, we face it together. Together, Kyle agreed, and through the pendant's magic their dreams began to merge once again. The bloodline scroll had been hidden beneath the Vampire Council chamber for over 8 centuries, its existence known only to the eldest members of the court. When Elder Matthias unrolled the ancient parchment on the obsidian table before the assembled council, the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of supernatural power contained within its genealogical records. Evelyne sat between Kyle and Elder Matthias, trying not to show how intimidated she felt by the 7 ancient vampires who comprised the ruling council. Each was old beyond mortal comprehension, their combined ages spanning millennia of vampire history. They had summoned her to determine her status and assess any threat she might pose to established order, but she could sense through her bond with Kyle that this meeting would reveal far more than anyone had anticipated. The bloodline scroll contains the genealogical records of every supernatural bloodline in the known world, Elder Counselor Lysander explained, his voice carrying the authority of extreme age. If young Evelyne possesses heritage beyond the purely mortal, these records will reveal it. And if she does not? Asked Counselor Morgana, her pale eyes fixed on Evelyne with obvious skepticism. Then we will know that the binding was truly an accident, and we can proceed accordingly, Lysander replied, though his tone suggested he already suspected otherwise. Elder Matthias began to trace his finger along the ancient text, following bloodline after bloodline through the centuries. The scroll was massive, its surface covered in script written in dozens of languages, some of which predated human civilization. As he searched, soft murmurs of power emanated from the parchment, responding to the magic that had created it. Here, Matthias said suddenly, his finger stopping on a section of text that began to glow with soft silver light. The line of Whitmore, traced back to its origins. Evelyne leaned forward, her heart racing. Through her bond with Kael, she could feel his tension as they waited to learn what the scroll would reveal. "Interesting," Matthias murmured, his ancient eyes scanning the text. "Very interesting indeed." "Well?" Councillor Morgana demanded impatiently. "What does it say?" Elder Matthias looked up from the scroll, his expression grave. "According to these records, the Whitmore line originates not from mortal stock, but from the union of a vampire lord and a mortal woman blessed by the old magic." The chamber fell silent except for the soft whisper of supernatural energy that seemed to emanate from the scroll itself. Evelyne felt Kael's shock through their bond, followed immediately by a fierce, protective surge. "That would make her," Councillor Benedict began. "A descendant of the first vampire mortal binding in recorded history," Matthias finished. "But there's more." He traced his finger further along the glowing text, and additional passages began to illuminate. The original binding was not between any vampire lord, but between Lord Lucian Ravencrest Kyle's own ancestor and Lady Ariana Whitmore. The implications hit the chamber like a thunderbolt. Evelyne felt the world tilt around her as she processed what Elder Matthias had just revealed. "You're saying that Evelyne and I are," Kyle began, "descended from bloodlines that were bound centuries ago," Matthias confirmed. "The magic that drew her to the sacred binding altar was not random chance, but an echo of a connection forged by your ancestors over 600 years ago." Councillor Lysander leaned forward, his ancient face grave with the weight of this revelation. "Show us the rest of the record. If what you suggest is true, there should be more." Elder Matthias continued reading, his voice growing more amazed with each line. "Lady Ariana Whitmore was no ordinary mortal. She was the last of the star-born beings touched by celestial magic who served as bridges between the mortal and supernatural worlds." "The star-born were legend," Councillor Morgana protested. "They died out centuries before the first vampires walked the earth." "Apparently not," Matthias replied, his finger tracing more text. "According to this, small populations of starborn survived by intermarrying with mortals, their bloodlines lying dormant until awakened by powerful magical events." Evelyne's hand went instinctively to the silver locket at her throat. "My mother's flower," she whispered. "She said it would bloom eternal for those who carried love's true heritage." "The forget-me-not is one of the sacred flowers of the starborn," Elder Matthias said gently. "Your mother may have known more about your heritage than she was able to tell you." Through their bond, Kael felt Evelyne's mixture of wonder and grief at this revelation. To learn that her beloved mother had carried such knowledge, had perhaps even tried to prepare her daughter for a destiny neither of them fully understood, it was both gift and tragedy. "There's still more," Matthias continued, his voice dropping to an almost reverent whisper. "The original binding between Lord Lucian and Lady Ariana produced children hybrid offspring who carried both vampire power and starborn abilities. The bloodlines were meant to unite again when the time was right." "A prophecy," Councillor Benedict breathed. "You're describing a prophecy." "Indeed. The scroll speaks of a time when darkness would threaten the supernatural world, when only the reunion of the bloodlines could restore balance. It names the signs. When shadow rises from the eastern lands and ancient evils stir, the daughter of stars shall bind herself to the son of night, and their union shall herald either salvation or the end of all." The chamber erupted in whispered conversations as the council members absorbed the implications. Evelyne sat in stunned silence, trying to process the fact that her entire life had apparently been leading to this moment. "The eastern threats," Kael said suddenly, his voice cutting through the murmur of voices, "the dark forces that have been gathering beyond our borders." "May be the shadow the prophecy speaks of," Matthias confirmed, "which would make your binding not an accident of fate, but the fulfillment of an ancient foretelling." Councillor Morgana rose from her seat, her face pale with implications. "If this is true, If Evelyne truly carries starborn heritage and their binding fulfills this prophecy, then everything changes. The political ramifications alone. The political ramifications are the least of our concerns, Elder Matthias interrupted. If the prophecy is accurate, then Evelyne and Kyle together possess power that could either save our world or destroy it. What kind of power? Evelyne asked, finding her voice at last. Matthias consulted the scroll once more. Starborn could manipulate the fundamental forces of magic itself, not just vampire abilities or mortal witchcraft, but the underlying energies that govern all supernatural phenomena. Combined with Kael's vampire heritage, particularly his bloodline connection to the original binding, we could be looking at the most powerful supernatural union in recorded history, Kael finished, understanding immediately. The weight of this revelation settled over the chamber like a shroud. Evelyne felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning about herself, about her connection to Kyle, about the destiny that had apparently been shaping her entire life without her knowledge. "There's one final detail," Elder Matthias said quietly, his finger resting on the last illuminated passage of the scroll. "The prophecy states that the union will be tested by forces seeking to prevent its fulfillment. Enemies will arise, who fear the power the bloodlines could wield together." "The Blood Moon Court," Councillor Benedict said grimly. "Lady Seraphina's family has been acquiring territory and allies in the eastern regions. If they've allied themselves with the dark forces, then they may seek to destroy Evelyne before she can fully awaken to her heritage," Ka-El finished, his voice carrying deadly promise. Through their bond, Evelyne felt his fierce protectiveness surge even stronger. But she also sensed something else, a recognition that their relationship had moved far beyond personal choice into the realm of cosmic responsibility. "What does this mean for us?" she asked quietly. "For our future?" Elder Matthias rolled up the bloodline scroll carefully, its glow fading as the magic settled back into dormancy. "It means that you are no longer just Kael's bound mate child. You are potentially the key to either salvation or destruction, and there will be those who will do anything to ensure you never have the chance to discover which." The council chamber fell silent as the full weight of the prophecy settled over them. Evelyne reached for Kael's hand, needing the comfort of their connection in the face of such overwhelming revelation. Whatever she had been before entering this chamber, she was something entirely different now. Not just a servant girl accidentally bound to a vampire lord, but a woman whose very existence might determine the fate of the supernatural world. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "We face this together," Kael said quietly, echoing the promise they had made in the privacy of their chambers. But now, those words carried weight beyond personal commitment. They were a vow that might determine the future of everything they held dear. The Sword of Covenant had not left its resting place in the deepest vault of Castle Ravencrest for over 4 centuries, and when Elder Matthias first attempted to retrieve it, the ancient weapon refused to respond to his touch. Only when Kael and Evelyne approached the altar, where it lay together, their hands joined, did the legendary blade begin to glow with the pale fire that marked its recognition of a true royal pair. "The reports from our scouts grow more dire each day," Marcus informed them as they stood in the war room 3 days after the council meeting that had changed everything. Maps covered the massive oak table, marked with red ink, that showed the advancing forces of darkness that threatened their kingdom from the east. "The shadow armies have overrun 2 border settlements and are moving toward the mountain passes." Kael studied the tactical positions while Evelyne practiced drawing the Sword of Covenant from its specially crafted sheath. The weapon was surprisingly light in her hands despite its apparent size, and when she wielded it, she could feel power flowing through the blade like liquid starlight. "How long before they reach the outer defenses?" Kael asked, his tactical mind already calculating supply lines and defensive positions. "Perhaps a week, if they maintain their current pace," Marcus replied. "But my lord, these are not ordinary armies. The scouts report creatures of shadow and flame, beings that seem immune to conventional weapons. Then, it's fortunate we have unconventional weapons at our disposal, Elder Matthias observed from his position near the great windows. The Sword of Covenant was forged specifically to combat supernatural threats that normal blades cannot touch. Evelyne set the sword aside and moved to stand beside Kael, studying the maps with growing understanding. Through their bond, strengthened now by weeks of shared dreams and growing love, she could feel his strategic thinking as clearly as her own thoughts. "They're not just attacking randomly," she said suddenly, her finger tracing the pattern of destroyed settlements. "Look at the locations they've chosen. Every settlement they've destroyed sits on one of the ancient ley lines." Kyle looked at her sharply. "How do you know about ley lines?" I'm not sure," Evelyne admitted, touching her mother's locket unconsciously. "But I can feel them, like rivers of power running beneath the earth. And these attacks, they're systematically disrupting the flow of natural magic through the region." Elder Matthias approached the table, his ancient eyes bright with understanding. "Your star-born heritage is manifesting more strongly. The awakening of your bloodline is allowing you to perceive magical currents that most beings cannot sense. If they're targeting the ley lines," Kyle said slowly, "then they're not just invading territory, they're trying to corrupt the fundamental magical infrastructure of our realm." "To what end?" Marcus asked. Evelyne closed her eyes, letting her newly awakened senses expand beyond the confines of the war room. Through the strange perception that had been growing stronger each day, she could feel the network of magical energy that connected their kingdom to the greater supernatural world. And she could feel something else, a dark presence probing those connections, seeking weak points to exploit. "They're trying to sever our realm from the source of its power," she said, opening her eyes with sudden certainty. "If they can corrupt enough ley lines, they can cut us off from the magical forces that sustain vampire society." The implications sent a chill through the room. Without access to the magical energies that supplemented their supernatural abilities, vampires would become vulnerable, their strength and speed greatly diminished. "Then we cannot simply defend the castle," Kyle concluded. "We must take the fight to them before they complete their ritual." "My lord," Marcus protested, "the enemy forces vastly outnumber our own. A direct assault would normally be suicide," Kyle agreed. "But we have advantages they do not expect." He looked at Evelyne, and through their bond she felt his absolute confidence in her abilities she was only beginning to understand herself. "The Sword of Covenant responds to united starborn and vampire power," Elder Matthias explained. "Wielded together, it can channel energies that no single being could access alone." But, Evelyne prompted, "the weapon's power is proportional to the strength of the bond between its wielders. Doubt, fear, or emotional discord will weaken its effectiveness. You must trust each other completely, without reservation." Ka-El took Evelyne's hand, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. Through their connection, she felt not just his love for her, but his absolute faith in their partnership. The intensity of his trust took her breath away. "There's something else," she said quietly, an idea beginning to form. "If I can perceive the ley lines, perhaps I can also influence them. Instead of simply fighting the shadow armies, what if we could turn their own strategy against them?" "Explain," Ka-El commanded, though his tone held interest rather than skepticism. "They're corrupting the ley lines to cut us off from magical power," Evelyne said, her thoughts racing as the plan took shape. "But what if we could reverse the flow? Instead of letting them drain power away from our realm, we could draw power from theirs." Elder Matthias stared at her in amazement. "That level of magical manipulation, it's theoretically possible for a star-born of sufficient strength, but the risks—" "What risks?" Kyle asked. "If Evelyne attempts to redirect ley line energy on such a massive scale and fails, the magical backlash could destroy her mind," Matthias explained gravely. "Or worse, It could corrupt her starborn essence, turning her power against those she seeks to protect. The room fell silent as they contemplated the stakes. Through their bond, Kael felt Evelyne's fear not of the personal danger, but of the possibility that she might inadvertently harm him or their people. There might be a way to minimize the risk, Elder Matthias continued slowly. If Kael maintains constant contact with you throughout the working, his vampire strength could help anchor your consciousness and prevent the magic from overwhelming you. And if something goes wrong? Evelyne asked. Then we face the consequences together, Kael said simply, as we have everything else. Over the next 3 days, they prepared for what might be their final battle. Kael worked with his military commanders to organize the defense of Castle Ravencrest, while Evelyne trained with Elder Matthias to understand and control her expanding abilities. The star-born powers that had awakened within her were unlike anything she had expected. She could not only perceive magical energies, but manipulate them in ways that defied conventional understanding. When she focused her will, she could accelerate the healing of wounded soldiers, strengthen the castle's magical defenses, or even commune with the ancient spirits that dwelt within the mountain itself. Your mother would be proud, Elder Matthias told her as they practiced in the castle's highest tower, where the flow of magical energy was strongest. Few starborn in recorded history have shown such natural aptitude. Did she know? Evelyne asked. About what I might become? I believe she suspected, Matthias replied gently. The forget-me-not she preserved for you was more than just a keepsake. It was prepared with star-born magic, designed to awaken your heritage when you were ready to accept it. Evelyne touched her locket, feeling the warm pulse of magic that had always emanated from the pressed flower within. Her mother's final gift had been not just love, but the key to her true nature. On the night before the expected assault, Kael and Evelyne stood together on the battlements overlooking the mountain passes. In the distance, they could see the glow of unnatural fires where the shadow armies had made their camp. Through her enhanced senses, Evelyne could feel the corruption they carried, a wrongness that made her skin crawl and her star-born essence recoil in revulsion. "Are you afraid?" Kael asked, echoing the question they had asked each other so many times since their binding began. "Terrified," Evelyne admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing you, of failing our people." Kael pulled her closer, and she could feel his absolute certainty through their bond. "You will not fail. We will not fail. Whatever power your heritage grants you, whatever strength our bond provides, it will be enough." "How can you be so sure?" "Because," Kael said simply, "for the first time in 6 centuries, I have something worth fighting for, someone worth protecting. That kind of motivation has toppled empires." Above them, the stars wheeled in patterns that Elder Matthias said were favorable for starborn magic. Below them, the castle bustled with final preparations, weapons being sharpened, defenses being reinforced, and prayers being offered to whatever gods might listen. Tomorrow would bring battle unlike anything their realm had seen in generations. But tonight, Kael and Evelyne stood together under the vast sky, their bond stronger than fear, their love deeper than doubt. The sword of covenant rested in its sheath at Evelyne's side, ready to channel the combined power of vampire strength and starborn magic. Whatever the shadow armies brought against them, they would face it as they had faced everything else since that night when fate had drawn them together, united, unbreakable, and utterly determined to protect the world they had come to love. The heart of the mountain revealed itself at dawn on the day of the final battle, when Evelyne's awakening starborn senses led her and Kael deep beneath Castle Ravencrest to a chamber that had been hidden for millennia. The massive crystal formation pulsed with pure magical energy at the very core of their realm, its light casting prismatic rainbows across walls carved with symbols that predated any known civilization. "This is the source," Evelyne breathed, her voice filled with wonder and growing understanding. This is what they're really trying to destroy. The heart of the mountain stood nearly 20 feet tall, its crystalline surface shot through with veins of silver and gold that seemed to move like living things. Through her enhanced perception, Evelyne could feel the incredible power contained within not just magical energy, but the fundamental force that sustained all supernatural life in their realm. The legends spoke of such a thing, Kael said, his ancient memories stirring as he studied the crystal's hypnotic patterns. A nexus point where the barriers between worlds grew thin, where the first vampires drew the power to transform themselves from mortal to immortal. Above them, the sounds of battle had already begun. The shadow armies had arrived with the rising sun, and the castle's defenders were engaged in desperate combat to hold the outer walls. But down here, in the hidden chamber beneath the mountain's roots, Evelyne finally understood the true nature of the conflict they faced. "They're not trying to conquer our territory," she said, her hand pressed against the crystal's warm surface. "They're trying to corrupt the heart itself. If they can turn this power source to darkness, every supernatural being connected to it would be corrupted as well," Kael finished grimly. "Or destroyed outright if they couldn't adapt to the change." Through their bond, Evelyne felt his growing urgency. The sounds of battle above were growing louder, more desperate. Their people were fighting valiantly, but against enemies of shadow and flame, conventional weapons could only delay the inevitable. "We need to get back," Kael said. "If the outer defenses fall." "Wait!" Evelyne's voice carried new authority as her starborn heritage fully awakened in the presence of such concentrated power. "This is where we make our stand. Not on the battlements, but here, at the source of everything they seek to destroy." She drew the sword of covenant, and immediately the blade blazed with silver fire that reflected and amplified the heart's pulsing light. Kael felt the weapon's power through their bond, a sensation like holding concentrated starlight wrapped in steel. "You want to channel the heart's power directly," he realized. "Use it to fuel your plan to reverse the ley line corruption." "It's the only way," Evelyne said, though her voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "But Kael, if I connect directly to this much raw magical force, what aren't you telling me?" Through their bond, she couldn't hide the truth from him. "There's a chance I won't survive the process. The amount of power required to redirect the ley lines across the entire realm, a mortal mind, even one touched by starborn heritage, might not be able to contain it." Kael's response came without hesitation. "Then we share the load. The bond between us can distribute the magical strain across both our essences." "You could die too," Evelyne warned. "So could everyone we care about if we don't try." Kael moved to stand beside her, his hand closing over hers on the sword of covenant's hilt. "We face this together, or not at all." The chamber suddenly shook as something massive struck the castle above them. Dust rained from the ancient ceiling, and cracks appeared in the stone walls. The shadow armies had breached the outer defenses. "They're coming," Evelyne said, her enhanced senses detecting the approach of creatures that radiated wrongness like heat from a forge. "The enemy commanders, they know about the heart. They're making straight for this chamber." Kael drew his own blade, its steel edge gleaming with the same silver fire that surrounded the sword of covenant. "Then we hold them here while you work. How long do you need?" "I don't know," Evelyne admitted. "This kind of magic, I'm working purely on instinct and hope." "Then I'll give you as much time as I can." The first shadow creatures burst through the chamber's entrance like living nightmares. They moved with fluid grace that defied their monstrous forms, their claws and fangs dripping with poison that hissed when it touched the stone floor. Kael met them with vampire speed and centuries of combat experience, his blade carving silver arcs through their dark forms. But for every creature he destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. And behind them came something far worse, a figure cloaked in absolute darkness, whose very presence made the heart of the mountain's light flicker and dim. "Lady Seraphina," Kyle breathed, recognizing his former intended bride despite her transformation. "What have you done to yourself?" The creature that had once been the beautiful vampire noble laughed with a sound like breaking glass. "I have embraced power greater than your pathetic court could ever imagine, Kyle, and now I have come to claim what should have been mine." Her dark gaze fixed on Evelyne, who stood with her hands pressed against the heart of the mountain, silver light beginning to flow between her fingers as she attempted to establish connection with the massive crystal. "The little servant girl who destroyed my plans," Seraphina hissed. "How fitting that she should die in the place that gave birth to our kind." She raised her hand, and darkness gathered around her like a living thing. Kyle moved to intercept her attack, but more shadow creatures poured into the chamber, forcing him to divide his attention between multiple threats. Evelyne felt the magical connection beginning to form between herself and the heart, power flowing through her in amounts that made her previous experiences seem like candle flames compared to a bonfire. Through her bond with Kyle, she could feel his strain as he fought to protect her while she worked. "Hold on," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. "Just hold on a little longer." The heart of the mountain pulsed brighter, responding to her touch, and Evelyne felt her consciousness begin to expand across the network of ley lines that connected their realm to the greater magical universe. The real battle was just beginning. The crown of United Realms materialized above Evelyne and Kyle in the exact moment when their combined power reached its peak, formed from pure magical energy and centuries of prophetic destiny. As Evelyne's consciousness expanded through the network of corrupted ley lines, and Kyle fought desperately to protect her physical form, the ancient crown descended to rest upon both their heads simultaneously, a symbol of union that transcended the physical realm. Through the heart of the mountain's power, Evelyne could perceive the entire magical infrastructure of their world, as if looking down at a vast map drawn in rivers of light. She could see the Shadow Army's corruption spreading like poison through the ley lines, each infected node sending darkness deeper into the network. But she could also see something the enemy had not anticipated. The power source they sought to corrupt was fighting back. "Now," she whispered, her voice echoing with starborn authority that made the very air shimmer. "Kyle, now!" Their bond, strengthened by weeks of growing love and trust, allowed them to act as a single entity despite their separate forms. As Kyle's blade cut through the last of the shadow creatures between them and the transformed Seraphina, Evelyne seized control of the corrupted ley lines and began to reverse their flow. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for their enemies. Instead of draining power from the realm's magical sources, the reversed ley lines began drawing energy from the shadow realm itself. The dark creatures shrieked as their connection to their home dimension became a liability, their forms beginning to dissolve as their essential darkness was pulled back through the very conduits they had sought to exploit. "Impossible," Seraphina snarled, her transformed features twisting with rage and growing desperation. "You're just a servant. You cannot possibly command such power." "She is not just a servant," Kyle replied, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "She is my mate, my equal, and the rightful heir to magic older than your ambition." The crown of United Realms blazed with brilliant light as it settled more firmly upon their joined consciousness. Through it, Evelyne could feel not just her own starborn heritage, but Kyle's vampire strength and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Together, they were indeed more than the sum of their individual parts. But the magical strain was enormous. Even shared between them, the effort required to redirect power across an entire realm was pushing both their essences to the breaking point. Through their bond, Kyle could feel Evelyne's mortal frame struggling to contain forces that had never been meant for a single being to wield. The crown, Elder Matthias's voice reached them from the chamber entrance, where he had arrived with reinforcements just as the tide of battle turned. "It's distributing the magical load across both your life forces." The prophecy spoke of this, the union that would reshape the supernatural world. Seraphina made one final desperate assault, gathering the last of her corrupted power into a spear of pure darkness aimed at Evelyne's heart. But Kyle intercepted the attack with the Sword of Covenant, and when dark magic met the combined power of vampire strength and starborn light, the collision created a flash of energy that lit the entire chamber like a second sun. When the light faded, Seraphina's transformed state had been stripped away, leaving her as she had been before her corruption, beautiful, powerful, but no longer enhanced by shadow magic. She collapsed to her knees, the weight of what she had done crashing down upon her. "It's done," Evelyne said, though her voice was weak with exhaustion. Through her expanded consciousness, she could feel the ley lines settling into their new configuration, no longer vulnerable to corruption, but actively hostile to any attempt at dark manipulation. The network is purified and protected. The crown of United Realms began to fade as the immediate crisis passed, but it left behind a permanent change in their bond. Kael could feel it, a depth of connection that went beyond emotion or even magical linking. They had become something new together, a partnership that existed on multiple levels of reality. "The shadow armies?" Kael asked, though through their enhanced bond he could already sense the answer. "Retreating," Elder Matthias confirmed, his ancient eyes bright with amazement. "Without their connection to the corrupted ley lines, they cannot maintain their presence in our realm. The threat is ended." Seraphina looked up at them from where she knelt, her eyes filled with something that might have been regret. "You have won this day," she said quietly. "But there will be other threats, other enemies who fear what you represent." "Let them come," Kael replied, helping Evelyne to her feet as the last traces of the crown's power settled into their shared consciousness. "We will face them as we have faced everything else together." Through the heart of the mountain, Evelyne could feel the pulse of renewed life flowing through their realm. The magical infrastructure was not just restored, but strengthened, capable of supporting new growth and protecting against future corruption. "The prophecy is fulfilled," Elder Matthias said with deep satisfaction. "The Daughter of Stars has bound herself to the Son of Night, and their union has indeed brought salvation." As they emerged from the hidden chamber beneath Castle Ravencrest, the first light of a new dawn was breaking over the mountains. The shadow armies were gone, the threat ended, and the supernatural world had been forever changed by the love between a servant girl who carried starlight in her blood and a vampire lord who had learned that true power came not from dominion but from partnership. Their bond was complete, their destiny fulfilled, and their future together just beginning. The Garden of New Beginnings bloomed for the first time in 3 centuries on the morning after the Shadow Army's defeat, its long dormant soil suddenly erupting with flowers that had been waiting generations for the right magical conditions to awaken. Evelyne discovered it quite by accident, following a pull she couldn't name through corridors of Castle Ravencrest she had never explored, until she found herself standing before a pair of ornate doors that opened at her touch. Beyond lay a courtyard that took her breath away. Forget-me-nots carpeted the ground in waves of blue that seemed to stretch forever, interspersed with silver roses that caught the morning light like captured moonbeams. Ancient fruit trees, heavy with blossoms, lined pathways that led to a central fountain where crystal-clear water danced in patterns that defied gravity. "It's beautiful," Kyle said softly, joining her in the doorway. Through their bond, now deeper and more complete than ever, she could feel his wonder matching her own. The garden was planted by Lady Elena and Lord Victor, Elder Matthias explained, appearing behind them with the quiet grace that had marked his movements for centuries. They designed it to bloom only when their bloodlines were reunited and the realm was at peace. Evelyne walked among the flowers, her silver locket warm against her throat. When she knelt to touch one of the forget-me-nots, she could swear she felt her mother's presence, a gentle warmth that spoke of love transcending death and time. "She would be proud of you," Kael said, reading her emotions through their connection. I think she knew, Evelyne replied, her voice soft with wonder. Somehow, she knew this day would come. It had been a week since the final battle, and the changes wrought by their victory were becoming more apparent with each passing day. The vampire court, once fractured by political maneuvering and ancient grudges, had united behind their leadership with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. The revelation of the prophecy and its fulfillment had shifted the entire foundation of supernatural society. Lady Seraphina has requested an audience, Marcus informed them as they settled on a marble bench beside the dancing fountain. She wishes to formally apologize for her actions and pledge her house's loyalty to your joint rule. Our joint rule? Evelyne asked, though through their bond she could feel Kael's lack of surprise at the phrase. The council has voted unanimously, Elder Matthias explained, with a smile that made his ancient face look almost youthful. You are to be crowned as joint sovereigns of the vampire realm, the first true partnership to rule our kind in recorded history. The idea still felt surreal to Evelyne. 6 months ago, she had been a servant whose greatest aspiration was to avoid notice. Now she was being asked to help govern an entire supernatural civilization. Are you ready for such responsibility? Kael asked gently, though his tone carried no doubt about her capabilities. With you beside me? I think I am, Evelyne replied, and through their bond she felt his surge of love and pride in her growth. The ceremony is planned for the next full moon, Marcus continued. Representatives from every supernatural realm have requested permission to attend. Your union has created ripples throughout our world. Good ripples, we hope, Evelyne said with a smile. The best kind, Elder Matthias assured her. Your love story has become legend among our people, a tale of destiny fulfilled and true partnership conquering impossible odds. As the days passed, Evelyne found herself settling into her new role with surprising ease. Her star-born abilities, fully awakened by their trials, made her naturally attuned to the needs and concerns of their subjects. She could sense unrest before it became rebellion, feel the pulse of the realm's magical health, and perceive threats long before they manifested as actual danger. Kael, meanwhile, had been transformed by their bond in ways that amazed everyone who had known him before. The cold calculation that had once marked his rule had been tempered by warmth and genuine care for his people's welfare. Together, they governed not through fear or absolute authority, but through wisdom and compassion that earned loyalty more lasting than any political alliance. Do you ever regret it? Kael asked one evening as they walked through the Garden of New Beginnings, now their favorite retreat from the demands of leadership. The life you might have had if you had never entered that ballroom. Evelyne considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked about her feelings. Through their bond, she knew he genuinely wanted to understand her heart, not just hear what he hoped to hear. I used to dream of a simple life, she said finally. A cottage somewhere quiet, perhaps a husband who was kind, children to love and protect, normal human things. And now I have something I never dared dream of, she replied, stopping to face him in the moonlight. A partner who knows my deepest thoughts and loves me for them. A purpose that uses gifts I never knew I possessed. A future that stretches beyond mortal limitations. She reached up to touch his face, marveling as always at the perfection of his features and the warmth in his dark eyes. Most importantly, she continued, I have you. And Kael, I would choose this life, choose you in every possible world, in every possible timeline. What we have together is worth any sacrifice. Through their bond, she felt his overwhelming love and gratitude, emotions so intense they brought tears to her eyes. Even after months together, the depth of his feeling for her could still surprise her. And I would choose you, he said, pulling her close. In every life, in every form, across every barrier that might try to keep us apart. Above them, The stars wheeled in patterns that spoke of destiny fulfilled and new chapters beginning. The garden around them bloomed eternal, a testament to love that had conquered darkness and death itself. In the distance, Castle Ravencrest stood strong and proud, its windows glowing with warm light that welcomed all who approached in peace. The realm they ruled together was prospering, its magical foundations stronger than they had been in centuries. Their love story had begun with an accident, a servant girl's desperate flight leading to an unintended touch that bound two souls for eternity. But it would continue by choice, day after day, year after year, as they built a future neither had imagined possible. The garden of new beginnings bloomed around them, and the world was full of infinite possibility.